the heart of adversity, our guest today, Kyle Jetsel, discovered that life's most formidable challenges could be transformed into profound opportunities for growth. Growing up in a tough neighborhood, Kyle found himself in a world where the line between safety and chaos were razor thin. In this episode, Kyle takes us on a deeply personal journey, sharing how he navigated the turbulent seas of his youth. Kyle faced yet another colossal test of faith when his beloved wife of 30 years, a source of love and strength, suddenly passed away. The impact of this loss was felt not only in his own life but also within the lives of their 6 children, one of whom has a severely aggressive form of autism. It was in these darkest hours that Kyle leaned into God's strength like never before. He turned to a simple yet powerful strategy that helped him find his way back to hope and healing, all while knowing that God's grace was the cornerstone of his journey. Get ready to be deeply moved by Kyle's remarkable journey of faith and resilience, proving that we are never alone when we lean on God's strength and embrace his mysterious, undeserved grace. This episode is a testament to the human spirit's ability to rise above adversity. So grab a tissue, find a quiet space, and prepare for an unforgettable story.
So I was born and raised in an area of Dallas, Texas, in an inner city area, kind of in an area called Oak Cliff. It's kind of like the hood of Dallas, I guess, is what a lot of people call it. So I kind of grew up learning some very specific things, kind of survival tactics, I would say. And those survival tactics are the violence and the threat of violence are very good motivators.
Yeah.
So in the area that I grew up in, you either stood up for yourself and you were physical and strong, or you really didn't do very well in my neighborhood. And by looking at me, I know that you'd say, that doesn't make any sense. Look at this guy. He looks like he's from middle America, suburbs. But I didn't look like this forever. I hadn't always looked like that. Yeah. So growing up, I kind of lived in a chaotic atmosphere and really kind of had to, I'll say, fight to survive. Right. And so to speak. And so it kind of molded me in some ways that I had to really look at from the outside in, because I realized, go ahead.
Well, okay, I just pause you for a second and go back. Like, did you dress the part of like a gangbanger or anything like that, or
No,
to be
no,
tougher?
no. And I think that's kind of a misnomer too. There's few kids that dress like that, but most of the kids just don't have any money. So you don't get to choose what you wear. A lot of what you wear is hand-me-down jeans or t-shirts, or So I didn't run with any gangs, but certainly going to the inner city schools, you were associated with kids that had those, that were in that world. I did my best to stay out of that world, but it doesn't mean you didn't cross paths with people. And again, part of I think part of the whole process was, if I'll share an experience with you. When I was in elementary school, this was 5th grade. So I was probably, I don't know how old 5th grade is, really young.
Yeah.
I was sitting down at lunch one day and somebody came up and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, you're going to fight Gennaro Cardoza today after lunch." And I said, "Well, I don't have a problem with Gennaro." And they said, "Yeah, he didn't have a problem with you either, but you're going to fist fight down in this little area that the teachers can't see."
Oh,
Now,
wow.
I didn't have a problem with Gennaro. I knew Gennaro. He knew me. We weren't best friends, but we were acquainted. And, the thing, at this point, you have to decide, am I going to fist fight this kid or am I not going to fist fight this kid, right? Well, if you don't fist fight this kid, I already knew this, you were in for a long, hard road, right? Now, if you do fist fight him, you're probably going to get beat up a little bit, which Gennaro was probably going to beat me up a little bit, but at least I would stand my ground, and then I could stand a little taller, and, it was just kind of my turn. And so I remember going out and fist fighting Gennaro Cardoza at lunchtime. And he whooped me pretty good. He was a little tougher kid than I was at the time. And afterwards, there was the whole conversation about who won, and, just kids. But at that point forward, I didn't really get tapped to do that anymore. They just wanted to know who would fight and who wouldn't. And so you kind of had to have this air of, don't mess with me or I'll fight back kind of an attitude.
Sure.
Otherwise, you
Because then they knew, well, if you're not going to fight there, we can get you.
Right.
But if you're going to fight, oh, wow, that's interesting. That's like 9 or 10 years old. That's really young
Yeah.
to be doing that. Do you still know that Gino kid?
You know what? Gennaro Cardoza became a
Gennaro?
really good friend of mine. Yeah, we
Okay.
actually, after high school, we actually boxed in the same organization.
Really?
And after that fight, we actually became better friends. We played sports together
Hmm.
through middle and high school. Yeah, I know Gennaro. We 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 haven't really talked about that event, but I wouldn't want to fight him again. I promise you that.
Yeah. Um, well, good. So you're growing up in the kind of the hood, as if you will, and get to high school. Like, what is your home family like? Were you going to church? Did you have a faith at all?
Yeah, we did. We went to church. We went to church and we were consistent about going to church. That was one thing we always did as a family every Sunday. Um, but my home life was kind of chaotic, right? My dad was lower middle class, employed, kind of jumped from job to job, so we never had a lot of money. And I had two older brothers, one younger brother, one younger sister, and we were kind of like kids are. We were kind of feral, just a bunch of animals running around acting crazy.
Yeah.
And I think that created an environment for my mom. My mom was a tiny little lady, but she could really wield it, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I felt like there seemed to be a lot of stress and chaos in our home, either from, lack of money or just brothers being brothers, right?
Yeah.
The arguments and fights and all the things that went along with that. And so, I knew, and I kind of had, I think, what I refer to as, I call it poor white rage, is what I call it, right?
Okay.
Because I didn't like being this poor kid with nothing. It seemed like everybody else I knew had a silver spoon in their mouth. The kids that I went to church with,
Yeah.
we kind of traveled outside of Dallas into like a suburb to go to church. And all these kids there I thought they were rich. They weren't rich. They just had, new tennis shoes. That was all, right? They were
Okay.
just regular kids.
Yeah.
But it gave me this really bitter, mean internal mechanism. And, like I mentioned, after high school, I played a lot of high school sports because it gave me a chance to be physical and angry and take out my energy on other people and not get in trouble. And after I graduated high school, that was all taken away. I wasn't a good enough athlete to, play any more sports. And I ended up joining a boxing club
Mhm.
for one specific reason. And that reason was I could beat on people without getting arrested, right? It was a way to get that energy out.
Mhm.
And but I knew ultimately that I didn't want to live in that environment. I didn't want to raise my own kids in the chaos in that kind of world. So when I started dating, I started looking for girls from the suburbs who were, I would call them very, very feminine, uh, super duper sweet,
Mhm.
super kind. I didn't, I knew how far one way I was. So I kind of looked for somebody who was, and it probably was a crazy idea if I could find somebody on the far other end of beauty and sweetness and kindness. But eventually I found my wife after looking for years and years. I ended up marrying my wife, if I were to describe her, I would describe her as the most feminine, beautiful Southern belle personality,
Okay.
very steady. She wasn't up and down with her emotions. She was very like rock solid
Mhm.
with her emotional life.
Mhm.
And and I knew she would be good for me, right? I didn't
Yeah.
realize how good
Now,
until
how old were you when you guys met and um, that?
so I had when we got married, I had just turned 25. I was for
Okay.
about a month earlier, and she had just turned 20. So she was barely
Okay.
out of her teens. So I'm 5 years older than she is.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I kind of captured her before the world got, I think, before she got into the real
Yeah.
meat of what there was
Do you
out there.
do you think maybe like you were thinking you were on this one, and if you find some way on the other end, like you'll meet in the middle, kind of
Yeah,
like
that's, I think that's really subconsciously, I knew that I couldn't marry somebody like me, right? I needed to marry somebody who was, and she was very spiritual as well. I remember when I asked her, or we were talking about possibly thinking about getting married, she said to me, well, if you want to marry me, we're going to be going to church every Sunday. And at the time I was, but I wasn't, when you're in those middle years, you're not as consistent. And she kind of put her foot down pretty hard at that moment and said, listen, I'm raising my kids in the church. If we're getting married, we're getting married in the church. We're going to go every Sunday. We're raising our kids in the church. And I remember saying, okay, that's perfect. Right. And I knew at that moment that that was going to be the one. So
Okay, that's awesome. And so, did you date for a long time before you got married?
we probably dated, she and I became friends more than we were really dating initially. I was dating somebody else and she was dating somebody else, but I met her somewhere and she had a tennis bracelet on. I said, you want to go play tennis? And she said, sure. So we ended up becoming friends. Like we would go do things together that were fun. Like we'd go to the amusement park. Or I remember one day she called me up and she said, hey, I'm going to this, at my church, I'm going to this chicken dinner. Well,
Okay.
fried chicken is my favorite. And I had a date with another girl and I said, I'm there. And I broke my other date to go with her, right? Because she and I had more fun. We
Yeah.
just had more fun. And then eventually what ended up happening is she ended up not dating anybody else and I ended up not dating anybody else. And we just spent all of our time together because we had so much fun. And I
Oh,
think
cool.
that's really, we were more friends than we were dating until nobody else was around.
Mhm.
And every time I wanted to do something, she was with me and I was with her. And it became like this. We kind of, I think, together realized, oh, this friendship has turned into love, right? And and so it was interesting. It was easy, and I think that was a big part of it for me. Is she provided so much tremendous value to my life? She didn't make it hard at all. And I don't know. I can't say how she saw me, but I certainly saw her in that vein. She brought so much beauty and joy and value to me that I didn't want to be around anybody else. It was just her at that point.
Oh, that's awesome. So you get married, and then what happens?
We started having kids. We had our first two sons, and they were like I was, feral. They were wild animals. But we had talked about making sure we did the right things, and we'd read books, and we weren't the kind to just sit back and let life happen. And so we were raising these two boys, and they were, even though they were crazy and wild because boys are, we were building this happy family, and we could see, you know, we could project how it was going to go because we were just really enjoying ourselves. And these two little boys were fantastic. Well, when our third son came along, uh, he was absolutely different.
Okay.
And this is 20 years ago or so. Yeah. And I remember nothing we had done with our first two sons to for discipline and to create happiness and joy was working with him.
Hmm.
And so we thought, I remember my wife and I talking about this. We thought, have we just lost all ability to parent? Because he is out of control, right? And back then we didn't know there was a spectrum of autism.
Right. Right.
And so to us, when somebody said autism to us back then, all we did was picture a little boy in a wheelchair just flapping his hands, right? We didn't
Mhm.
realize there was anything else. So at about 4 years old, we decided to put him in like a preschool to
Okay.
see if maybe it was just us, but we were messed up and maybe somebody else could, help us manage that. And after a couple of weeks, one of the teachers came to us and said, have you ever considered having him diagnosed with autism?
Hmm.
And initially we were dumbfounded. We thought, well, autism is a wheelchair with, hand flapping.
Hmm.
And so he described to us that it was a spectrum and that there was different levels. And we ended up getting him taken in and diagnosed. Classic autism is what his
Okay.
official diagnosis was, and that's on the more severe end of the spectrum. And I remember when we got the diagnosis, she and I looked at each other, and it was almost a relief
Hmm.
because now we thought, well, we're just not horrible parents all of a sudden. He's
Okay.
got some challenges. We'll get him the help he needs through, um, therapies and experts and specialists and all this stuff. And we started that process. But what we realized very shortly after that is, although that worked, it didn't help us at home.
Okay.
Right? He would go to therapies. They would say he's doing great. And he would come home and he would melt down and throw a brick through a window. Right.
Oh.
Or we'd send him to a specialist. They'd say he's doing great. he would come home and he would, I'm trying to think of some of the stuff he did. He would scream like you couldn't believe how loud he could scream for an hour. And because he couldn't talk to us, we didn't know what it was he was upset about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we were trying so hard, and the stress was over the moon. And I'll never forget, after a year or two of this, the stress in our home was so overwhelming that it was causing my wife and I uh, stress between the two of us, right?
Yeah.
And it was causing my two older sons to be afraid of him, even though he was their little brother. And I remember I'd come home from work and it would be turmoil, and my wife would be worn out and destroyed, and he would have had meltdowns all day long and screaming and yelling. And, he would smash things and he would break things, and he would throw, if the TV glitched, he would throw something at it and smash the TV. It was just all the things when you talk about autism, the dark side of it, we were struggling with that self-harm, aggressive towards us and his brothers, trying to hit people, bite, kick, scream, whatever. You make a list of them, and we struggle with that.
Yeah.
And, my wife and I were getting more and more stressed out, and we really didn't have anywhere to turn at this point. And I remember it all came to a really like a head one Saturday morning at about 6:30 in the morning. We were awakened by my son screaming, this blood curdling scream, and we couldn't figure out what it was. And typically a meltdown would last anywhere from 10 minutes to maybe 90 minutes at the most.
Okay.
This one lasted 4 hours.
Wow.
And every time we would start to get him calmed down, he would ramp back up and start screaming. And by the time it was over, he had thrown a brick at me, hit me in the head, giving me, I'm sure I was concussed. He had smashed a window out of one of the rooms. His two older brothers they had locked themselves in their room to hide because they didn't want to get caught in the crossfire. And eventually we calmed him down. And I think sometimes when things are going wrong in our lives, we tend to want to blame somebody. And I think this is where my wife and I kind of turned on each other in that moment. And she started saying things like, if you would have just done this, he would have calmed down. And I said, well, if you didn't baby him some, right? And it just became this, right? And my wife wasn't the kind to really, she was this very feminine. She was more likely to cry, than she was argue. But at this time, she was arguing. She was done. I could tell this is it. I'm done with you, Kyle. I could tell she had it with me, because I wasn't really what she needed or what she wanted, and she wasn't living the life she expected. And I remember as we argued and argued, I realized that it wasn't going to end. And so I grabbed my keys and I went out on my front porch. We were living in a little suburb of Dallas called Red Oak at the time, Red Oak, Texas. And I grabbed my keys, put them in my pocket, and went out on the front porch. And I remember thinking, I was enraged. And I remember thinking, this is not what I signed up for. This is not the life I expected. Nothing is going right. We've done everything we're supposed to. There's no answer to this. This is a new life of turmoil and pain and suffering our whole lives. And I'm not doing it. And I'm going to get in my car and leave, and I'm not going to come back. And I remember. Go ahead.
Well, is that a conversation with God that you were having then?
It happened shortly after that, very shortly after that, because in that moment, I remember thinking I'm leaving. And in that moment, a memory that my father had taught me when I was about 11 years old. I was playing in a baseball game, and there was 2 outs, and all we needed was 1 out, and we get to win. We get to win the game. Well, somebody hit the ball to me, and I made an error. And the next kid got on base, and the next kid, and they ended up winning, and we lost, and it was all my fault. And in that moment, when you're 11 years old, that's your life, right? I mean, that's the biggest thing in your world. And I went to my dad, and I kind of had tears in my eyes. And I said, I wish they wouldn't have hit the ball to me, because then we could have won.
Oh.
And my dad, I remember, leaned down, he got on my level, and he said, you know what, Kyle? That's not the way we do things in this life. He said, you want to be the reason for success or failure. He said, you're not always going to win, but don't you ever go down without the biggest fight. If something's important to you, don't you ever quit. Don't you ever go down without the biggest fight in your life. And I remember that moment. I remember that lesson he had taught me, and I thought, I don't know what else to do, though. I've sent him to all the experts and specialists. We've tried everything. And then at that moment, I realized there was something else he had taught me. And it was, when you don't know what else to do, pray.
Oh.
Ask for guidance. So I walked over under, we had this huge pecan tree in our front yard. And I walked over under the pecan tree and just started praying.
Okay.
And I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I wasn't going to leave. I knew I wasn't going to leave. I determined that moment. And then as I prayed, I had this overwhelming feeling that God told me, you know what, don't leave. You can figure this out. Your family's important. But the thing I remember most is feeling like God said to me, the problem is not your kids and it's not your wife. The problem is you. Fix you and let the chips fall where they may. And I thought, yeah, but I argued with God in that moment, right? You don't understand.
Yeah.
I've tried everything. It's not me. It's the situation. But I kept feeling like I wasn't going to leave. And if I wasn't going to leave, I was certainly going to rely on, his divinity and his guidance. And that was the moment that I remember going back inside after feeling this. And I told my wife, I said, listen, I'm not leaving and I'm going to fix this. And she was still really mad at me. And she said, well, good luck. That's what she said in that moment. But I didn't care in that moment. I knew I wasn't leaving. And I was going to work and work and work. And even if I never figured it out, I was going to die trying. I just decided I'm not leaving. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to try to be the best dad I can be to my kids and the best husband. And I'm going to figure this out. And I'm going to serve as diligently as I can. And I think in that moment, I think I was, pressed up against such a hard wall that was a tipping point for me. And I really started turning to God on more and more occasions and really seeking the guidance that I really needed to really be the man I needed to be and part of that for certain was a lot of my past experiences had taught me I could manage things through this aggressive, manly way, right?
Okay.
You're going to do what I say. I'm a man. It's my home. You're going to do what I say. That wasn't working. And I really had to humble myself and almost be passive in a lot of situations. It took more strength for me to be passive and parent. I call it parenting in a spirit of love, right? Everything would start going wrong and I would stop and I would say, okay, how can I do this in a spirit of love?
Okay.
And as I started to do things in that spirit, things started to change dramatically in our home, even with my wife. And over the years, we created basically a curriculum for our family that took us on the brink of disaster we called ourselves a top 1% happy family, even as we faced, his violence or his meltdowns or his, all the things that came with it, self-harm. We would face those things in a spirit of love. And it brought Shelly and I closer together, my wife, and it even repaired our relationship. And prior to her passing, I heard her tell people that we have a top 1% happy marriage, she and I. And it's really, and I think our kids seeing that, she and I in love with each other so much, I think that mattered to them tremendously because they knew, mom and dad are like one. They're not, right? And so that was really, I think, the tipping point and really what created a world of happiness and joy. And really, again, challenges aren't going to be removed from us, right? The world is full of challenges. Our job is not to try to live an unchallenged life. It's to try to face those challenges with confidence and faith and turn to God when we, as frequently as we possibly can, most likely every night, to get the guidance that we need from him.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you hinted at part of the story that will definitely get you. Sadly, your wife is no longer with us, but let's talk about that point in time now. Your son was how old at this time, and then you have more kids. So how did that come about?
So my son was about 6 at the time, and he's my third son, and my fourth son had already been born. So we had 4 boys at that moment.
Oh.
And once we got the second diagnosis for my second son shortly after that. And we kind of did a nationwide search to find out where we might move that we could be protected from kind of the world. And we now live in Boise, Idaho. I live in Boise, Idaho with my family. And we have 6 kids now. My first 4 were boys. And my wife, because of her femininity and beauty, she was I always wanted to pass that down to a daughter. And after having 4 sons, I remember she told me, maybe I'm just supposed to have boys, right? And we had decided to kind of stop at that point having kids. Well, 6 years after my fourth son was born, she came to me and she had tears in her eyes and she said, I think we're supposed to try one more time for a girl, and she said, would you pray about it? And I said, sure. And it didn't take me long, right? My wife was, I feel like, very almost angelic. She was, I knew as soon as she said it that we were going to have more kids, right? Well, when she got pregnant shortly after, I was at work one day and she called me and she said, I'm headed over to get a sonogram, but I feel like you should be with me.
Right.
And when she said that to me, which she didn't do that often, but when she said, I feel like something, I knew that it was a good idea. And I was right on board. Well, we ended up going over to the sonogram. And as they were doing the sonogram, the doctor said, you got 2 babies in here.
Oh, okay.
And I said, you know what, doctor, we got 4 boys at home. That ain't funny.
Yeah.
And the doctor said, we don't joke about these things.
Yeah.
There's 2 babies in here. Well, shortly after we discovered one of them was a boy and one of them was a girl. So I have 5 sons and 1 daughter now.
Okay.
And she was a tremendous blessing to us, for Shelly as well, because there were times when I would come downstairs and Shelly would be in the kitchen with our daughter, Chloe, at 4 years old. And Chloe is up on a stool, baking with my wife. And I'm like, what are you doing? She said, I'm teaching her how to bake. And I said, she's 4. And I said, you think she can figure it out by now? And she said, well, she's going to figure it out either way. Right. And it was really beautiful to watch them there doing those things together. She taught her how to sew and to cook. And, she really just a lot of the things that made my wife who she is and the way she beautified the world, she passed that down to my daughter. So yeah, we have 6 kids.
Okay.
My 2 oldest are married now and out of the house with their wives. My 2 sons that are on the spectrum still live here. One is 24 and one is 21. And then my twins now are 15. I have a boy and a girl twins.
15. Wow. Gonna have 2 more drivers in the house here soon.
Real soon. Yeah.
That's exciting, I bet. Well, so then take us down the path of your wife, like, kind of what happened, and tell us about that story.
Yeah. So I think that's how we connected initially is, one of the things that I think one of the answers to our problem with autism was, hope and faith is great, right? Hope and faith and prayer are fantastic. But when we had our son on the autism spectrum, we realized very shortly afterwards that hope and faith and prayer is great, but we need a plan, right? We needed to know, really, we needed to create strategies for managing, his outbursts or violence, and we need to be very consistent for him. And so one of the things that I think created a world of beauty for us was that my wife and I sat down and said, okay, what is the challenge we're facing? Maybe he would have these tremendous meltdowns and we'd say, okay, if the challenge is a meltdown, we wanted to know what long-term we wanted to have happen. And my son still to this day has meltdowns periodically.
Okay.
And so we knew we couldn't take away the meltdowns, but we wanted to manage ourselves better.
Okay.
In those moments. And so we sat down and created worksheets for what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And be very consistent in how we did it so that whenever he did have a meltdown, we would know the steps we were going to take and the approach we were going to take. And always the first step is to put yourself in the spirit of love, right? Anytime you're facing a challenge, especially sometimes where they come at you with fists, it's awful hard not to freak out or flip out or panic or go into fight or flight. But one of the things that we got really good at was when we saw it happening, the challenge, we would say, put ourselves in the spirit of love first, right?
Okay.
And then what would we do if we faced this in a spirit of love? And a lot of times that calmed the whole situation down tremendously, right? And it became kind of a habit for us to, when we face new challenges, when we face difficulties, we would create worksheets and we would work together on how to do it, make adjustments, figure things out, and then we would apply that. And once we did, our kids would see consistency and they would feel love. We had this saying, which is, when they're at their worst is when they need us at our best.
Yes.
right?
Sure.
Now, but that's the hardest time, right?
Yeah.
When your kid is coming at you with his fist balled up, it's
Yeah.
awful hard to be loving, especially where I came from, right? Where I come from, if you take a swing at me, I'm going to knock you out. That's who I
Yeah.
am at my core. But that's not effective. It can't be effective in our own home, right? And so, we started creating plans and tactics and strategies that helped us to manage our family. It didn't mean the challenges stopped. What it meant was when things happened, we had a plan and we taught our kids what we were going to do, and we were very consistent. And so it didn't ruin our home, right? We
Okay.
would face the challenge, we would do it in a spirit of love, and then we would go back to being a happy family, right?
Well,
People would see us do this and they would be like, "What the heck is going on?" Right? And they, because we would say we want to be happy, we want to focus on that. Well, uh, my wife and I celebrated our 30th anniversary in June of 2021,
okay.
and shortly after that, a few months after that, she got really sick really quickly, and within 10 days of getting sick, she passed away suddenly. And she was in the hospital for those 10 days. And I recall, you know, uh, the Friday prior to her passing, she passed on a Monday. I felt the prompting that she was going to pass. I knew that she was. And so that Friday, I called all my kids in. I called all the ones that don't live with us and all my kids, and we sat down in the living room and I said, "Listen," uh, and I shared with them how their mom and I, whenever we were faced with trials or challenges or tragedy, we turned to the Lord. It's tempting. You're tempted sometimes when you get hit with real hard stuff to say, "How could you do this to me, God?
Right.
Didn't I try to do what was right? Didn't I? How could you do this, right? How could you let this happen?" And I didn't. I knew we weren't the first ones that this had happened to. And so I really wanted to set the stage for them. And I said, "Listen, your mom and I have been through tragedy together, and we've always turned to the Lord. And that, and raising, your brother on the spectrum, we've turned to the Lord. We've always turned to him for guidance and help and comfort." And I said, "No matter what happens with your mom, I am going to do that again." That
Okay.
is that he is the source of the happiness in our home. That is the source, right?
No,
You might think it's a lot of other stuff, but it's not.
that's not.
Our faith in God is the source of our happiness, and we turn to him during difficult times. And I invited each of my kids to do that. I said, no matter what happens, when you say your prayers tonight, you know, pray that you'll stay close, because it's vital that we do this. And I said, your mom and I have done this our whole lives. We're going to keep, no matter what happens, we're going to keep doing it. And so it was, I don't think they knew. My oldest son, I think, kind of knew,
Mm.
but we've never talked about it. We probably never will. Actually, we might, but um, it gave us an opportunity as a family to come together, right? And then when she did pass away, I knew we weren't the first ones that this had happened to. And so what I didn't do is turn inward and and uh, face the storm alone, right? I turned to God. I made it and had all my kids do that. But I also, again, faith and hope and prayer is good, but it's not a plan, right? And so I sat down with my kids and I said, "Listen, we've built something pretty cool here. Your mother was a huge part of this. She would want us to continue down this path. She didn't do all this for us to fall apart without her, right?" So we sat down and we crafted plans and we talked through a lot of these different things and we discussed how we were going to face this tragedy. And because of that, I think it's led us to really, we've all grieved in our own ways. We have different circumstances we face, but each of my kids knows. We actually wrote out a worksheet
Okay.
for when our mind starts to spin,
Cool.
right? Because it's going to be hard not for that to happen, and that's really going to chase us down a rabbit hole. And so we printed it off, and each of my kids has them, and they put them in their car and at home. And they're all over this house. So whenever my kids start to struggle, we look at that, we talk about it, and we face that with hope and faith and a plan, right? A plan for addressing those things.
Can you tell me a little bit about that worksheet? Like, what is it that's on there to help you get that plan together?
I love that you asked, because it has saved our family. And I want to start by telling you, this is a worksheet my wife had created for herself when she
Okay.
was here. I came home from work one day and she had like this grin on her face,
Mhm.
one of those grins like I figured something out, right?
Mhm.
And so I said, "What did you figure out?" And she said, "One of the problems with being a mom raising kids on the autism spectrum is you worry for their future tremendously.
Yeah.
What happens if something happens to me? Who's going to love them? Who's going to take care of them?" Right? They're difficult kids to manage, and nobody's going to love them like me. No, and she was struggling because it would keep her awake at night,
Mhm.
and it would encompass her, and she would be so worried that I came home from work one day and she said, "I created a worksheet." And I said, "What's your worksheet?" She said, "I realized that my emotions and my worry and my fear for his future is keeping me from being at my best self and
Okay.
loving him fully in the moment."
Okay.
And I said, "What kind of worksheet did you create? I want to see." Right. Well, she called this worksheet, she called it "The Devil Made Me," is what she called it. Right.
Okay.
Here's what she did. She said, she created a column in the middle, and on one side, she wrote down emotions that took her away from goodness.
Oh,
And on
okay.
one side, she wrote the opposite emotions, right? On one side, I remember she wrote, fear, worry, doubt, confusion, concern. And she said, all these emotions, when I start focusing on those emotions, they take me away from goodness and away from God.
Okay.
Right? Because if you're afraid, you start to spin, you think, "Oh my gosh, what am I going to do?" And then you get concerned and worried. Well, what she did was she took all those emotions, frightened, fear, discouragement, bitterness, frustration, and she wrote an opposite emotion on the other side of the sheet that would
Okay.
lead her towards God and towards goodness. And it was
Okay.
so beautiful because I thought, holy moly. So her idea was, if I can catch myself in these negative emotions, the ones that lead me away from God,
Mhm.
and write the opposite, and maybe I come up with a new emotion, maybe guilt. Right? Guilt can spin you down,
Mhm.
and that takes you away from goodness and away from God. And she said, "What's the opposite of guilt?" Right? So she wrote down, and it didn't even matter if it was real. What matters is that she created an opposite emotion of each of these things,
Okay.
and knew if she would focus on the opposite of that, that would lead her towards God and towards goodness. Right? And so I love this worksheet. And when she, I wonder if I have a copy of it. Would you Would you like me to take a second to see if I can find it for you? Or you wish,
Sure. Go. Yeah. Go ahead. Yep.
I think I probably can. Let me see here. Oh
Yeah, because I
yeah,
can edit this part out.
I
So
do have a good copy. I do. Okay, I'm going to put this here, and I'll share my screen with you and give you a copy of this.
that would be great. I think our
Oh,
listeners
here we
would
go.
love that. Is it letting you share the screen?
Let me pop here and share screen. Yes, it is. Yes. So this is her
Okay.
worksheet. How cool is that?
Look at that. Oh my goodness.
Now here's a link to my book, Facing My
Okay.
Biggest Fear: Surviving and Thriving After the Death of My Wife. But this is our good versus evil worksheet. The number one thing people don't seem to have control over is their minds, but that's the only thing we can truly control, right? And she wrote, there are ways that can lead us to success and those that can lead us to distress, but we have to be conscious of our thoughts, right? I think too often we let our thoughts run and we're not conscious of what we're thinking, and we can spin into depths, right?
Yes.
It can get away from us, and we go down a rabbit hole. And once
Mhm.
we're deep and we cannot escape, right? Now,
Right.
the best way to escape, obviously, is prayer, turn to God, but nobody wants to pray when they're in peril, right? Right? So, and God wants you to succeed, right? And He wants you to let your light shine and experience joy and peace. The devil would have you be miserable, discouraged, and bitter. Okay. So,
Mhm.
on one side, you can see the devil or evil obsesses, worries, doubts, discourages, confuses. And this list grew as she would have these emotions. And on the right hand side is God, and these are opposite. Instead of obsessing, be calm, right? Instead of be worried, be comforted. Instead of doubt, have belief and have faith. Discourage, the opposite of that is encourage, right? And you can see what she did here very, very clearly. Well, when she passed away, I told the kids, this can destroy families.
Yeah.
I've read a lot already, and I'm not waiting. I'm not going to wait for a day or a week or a month. I'm going to tell you guys right now, you're going to spend if you're not careful. And so we found her worksheet and pulled it up, and we kind of rebuilt it for our family. But it's the same principle, right? You got to catch yourself feeling bitter about her death. And if you do, what's the opposite of bitter? Is it on there? Yeah, sweetness. How neat is that, right?
Which is your wife, sweetness.
If you find yourself bitter about something, that can spin you towards evil, right? Away from good. Anything away from good is getting you towards evil, And so what can we focus on? We can focus on sweetness. We can focus on the sweetness she brought into this world. Or how do we exercise that? And what you focus on grows, right? And so we cut this little square out here, and we plastered it all over our house. It's in every bathroom. It's everywhere, because the key here is to catch yourself in those moments and to internalize this strategy so you can work on it, right? And this really has saved our family, because there have been moments for me. Even I feel like I'm one of the most buoyant, energetic, full of life fellows there is. But I've had moments where I've spun out of control, right? And I think it's natural. And so I'm going to do this. I'm going to copy this and send it to you in a message, if that's
Thank
okay.
you. I will share that with everybody. Absolutely.
I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to send it to you in a message real quick. And then I'll share an example of chat.
So do you just read through it and just do the mind shift to the God good side? Is that kind of
Yeah.
what
So
the process
how
is?
we internalize this is, I print this off. I'll print off 10 copies.
Okay.
And I hang one on a bulletin board in the kitchen. Or in the living room. I hang one on the kitchen door. I put one in each bathroom. I have one in each of my cars. The idea is to really internalize this, right? And to make it part of your life. And the way you do that is just by seeing it consistently, right? Condition yourself to see this everywhere you go, and realize we control what we think. And if we focus on the good stuff, we get good. If we focus on the stuff that takes us away from good, we don't get good. And it's hard, right? And I'll never forget, we had been doing this for about a month. And after my wife passed away, as you can probably imagine, 30 years of marriage, a top 1% happy marriage, I couldn't go in my room. I had huge anxiety, because everything in there was her. It smelled like her. It felt like her. There was a lot of pink in there, right? I mean, it was my wife. And I knew eventually I had to face that, right? And so I slept on the couch for about a month. And I remember one night thinking, clinically, I know the way to face anxiety is to take a little step in and step out, a little more in, little out, a little more in, little out, right? I know how to face difficult things and overcome anxiety. So I thought, tonight, maybe I don't sleep in there, but I'm just going to go in there and pray, like she and I had done together for years, right? And so I remember going up into my room, and I knelt at the end of my bed, which is, she and I had done that together for 30 years, right? And under my bed, I have this little pillow that I slide out, because I have sore knees.
Okay.
I knelt on this pillow and I started to pray, and I was overwhelmed with anger and bitterness towards God. How can I even pray to you? How could you do this to me, right? I've been kneeling at the end of this bed with my wife for 30 years. Is that not enough for you to save her, right? I mean, I started to spin, right? And almost immediately, I remembered this worksheet in that moment. And I stopped, and I thought, oh, I know what's going on here. The devil thinks I'm on shaky ground. Why not? If he's ever going to get me, he's trying right now, right? I know I'm a target. I know he thinks now's the time to get Kyle. If I can ever get him, I can get him mad at God. I can send him down this path. Now's my chance, right? And I realized that in that moment. And I thought, you know what? It ain't happening, man. I'm not going to turn away from God. I'm going to focus on my blessings. I'm going to focus on those good emotions. And I took that pillow and slid it to the side of the bed and started a new tradition in that moment, right? And
Okay.
prayed. And I was even able to sleep in my room that night because I was comforted. I was comforted in that moment. But I know there were moments after that where I know that when you're on shaky ground is when the adversary likes to get you
Oh
and
yeah.
throw things at you and tempt you, right? The idea behind this worksheet is that you're conscious of those emotions and those thoughts, and you can catch yourself early. Because if I didn't catch myself early, I could have spun into the depths of hell,
Oh yeah.
right? And when you start spinning down, and we all know we've all done it.
I've done it.
When you start spinning down and you spin deeper and deeper, it's hard to recover. It can almost become habitual, and you can get caught in your own despair, your own discouragement, your own un, unfairness, right? All those
Yeah.
things can really take you away from goodness and away from God. And so, the only reason I'm so grateful for the challenges we faced with my son, because it forced us. I think everything happens for a reason, and sometimes we
Yeah.
don't know why. But I think it forced us, and it forced me to be really conscious of, almost to step outside myself and look in and go, look at my own world and say, how can I rewrite or make this better for myself from the outside in? Take myself out of those emotions in that moment and just say, what can I do? Right. And create a plan that allows me to live and to thrive and to be at my very best, even through the tragedy, right? Even through those things that we are all going to face. None of us are going to escape the challenges and the difficulties, right? Our job is not to try to escape them. Our job is to turn to God
Yes.
and let him comfort us and let him help us through those moments,
Yeah.
and use those experiences in our life to help others, and really, to through example, to say, God is the source of my happiness. And no matter what happens to me, no matter what happens to us in our lives, we can have peace, we can have joy, and we can have goodness in our lives, even in the face of tragedy, if we turn to him and let him do that for us, turn
Yeah.
to him. So
Absolutely. And look what's happening now. I mean, Shelley created this because of the challenge that you had. And you were used to get through so many things after she passed. And now you're passing it on to other people who will be blessed by it. And that gives me goosebumps that, that's a Holy Ghost moment, like just how cool God can turn those things into amazing ways to help each other. And that's why I started this. I wanted people to get inspired by others, remembering to just stick with Jesus and not turn away during the difficult times. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm excited to share with other people and implement it in my own house. I think it's going to be everywhere tonight. So,
I love that. Thank you for doing
yeah,
that.
yeah, my pleasure. So you have a book, and have you published it so far? I can't remember.
No, it's just an ebook, but it's
Okay.
available to anybody. And the document that I sent you, it has a link to it.
Yep.
I would love for people to download it. A couple of years before my wife passed away, I was having a conversation with my brother, and just as good brothers do, goofy brothers, he said, "Hey, Kyle, what's your biggest fear?" And without even thinking, I said, "Losing Shelly."
Well,
Without even thinking, right? And so when she passed, I thought, "Holy crap!" Sometimes I think, should I not have said that? Did I challenge God? And I don't think that's the way it works, right? I really
no,
don't.
no,
I don't
no.
think that's the way it works. But I thought, what can I do during these moments? And so what I did each night is I sat down and I wrote stories about her and I, our love story, our
Okay.
marriage, how we had faced challenges, how I'm going to face the future without her, what I'm going to do with my kids, some of the experiences we had after she passed away, and each night I would write every night. And I think it was therapeutic because it required me to focus on the good, right? I was in pain. I was suffering. I was struggling. But focusing on the good just brought out that part of me that I think God wanted me to exhibit. And so this book is basically my diary
Okay.
and my thoughts and my feelings for the first 180 days, the first 6 months after she passed away. And
Okay.
so the idea is for people to see, I used to think before she passed away, I used to think, well, pain is inevitable, but suffering is a choice. And I'm rethinking that
Okay.
because I had moments where I couldn't avoid the suffering. I just couldn't. And so I wanted to get that on to, I didn't do it for anybody else. I did it for me, right? As part of my coping mechanism to focus on the good. But when I finished it, after 6 months, I was talking to somebody about it and they're like, holy crap, can I see? Is it too private? And I said, no, I don't, I don't really write like that. If there are vulnerable moments, but I don't mind. And so I gave it to them and they flipped the lid and they said, oh my gosh, Kyle, can you create it for other people? And so it ended up getting spread around and that's why I ended up creating it in a book. Yeah. And I
That's
want
awesome.
people to have it for free. I don't want to charge any money for it.
Well, that's very gracious of you, and I'll make sure people have the link for that as well. It's on the sheet that you shared, so they will definitely have that. And I look forward to reading it. So thank you so much. Any last thoughts you want to share with us?
Uh, well, you know what? I'll close with this. There's two things that I will caution people against.
Okay.
When you face tragedy, it's natural to turn inward
Mhm.
and to say, why me or why now or what have I done to deserve this? That's the worst thing you can do. Turn outwards, find people, find friends, call your friends, call family. Make sure you communicate outwardly. Connection with other human beings is vital. Okay. Connection with other human beings, connection with yourself. One of the reasons I wrote is to focus my mind on beauty and love and kindness. So connect with other people, connect with yourself, and connect with God. Right? You're going to be tempted, and this is the devil's way. Right? When you face tragedy, he wants you to say, "How could you do this to me, God?" That's what he wants, because he gets his claws in. Right? When your boat is rudderless and it's rocking, Satan's come. He that's when he wants to tempt you at your most, and you're going to be vulnerable. When you don't want to pray, pray.
Yeah.
When you don't feel worthy of prayer, pray. When you're mad at God, pray. Tell him you're mad.
Yeah.
Pray. No matter what, pray. Fall on your knees, do it out loud, and
Mhm.
pray. So don't lose those connections. Number one. And number two, don't wait to make a plan. I see
Mhm.
way too many people fall into tragedy and they think, well, when I get over this, I'll move forward in my life. It's a mistake. There's no better time than right now to sit down and say, I'm not going to just be battered by this storm. I'm going to fight this storm and I'm going to fight it through God's grace and through his guidance and through whatever guidance I receive in planning. I'm going to plan to do this in a beautiful way, in the right way. And so, connection with yourself, with deity, and with others is important. Do that. And also don't wait. Make a plan. Read books, start studying, start figuring out how you can face this storm with strength and courage and faith. And the storm will pass a lot quicker, number one. And number two, you'll get stronger from it. And that's my message.
Yeah. Well, Kyle, thank you so much. Thank you for being vulnerable and honest with us. I know it will inspire other people and bring hope to other people. So you have a wonderful day. So nice to meet you.
Thank you, Shari.